Hello, guys, and welcome back to this episode. In this episode, we are going to talk about ghosts. Already 90,000 years ago, we have traces of people believing in death and performing death rituals. In one of the many caves in Israel, that of School, has been found a corpse, or more or less kind of like the bones of a corpse, holding a boar. And so we believe that rituals connected to death have a very ancient, deep root. So a question emerges, and the question is, what about ghosts? The first trace that we have, that I'm aware of, is that of the Bible, that is present in the Bible, where Saul, the king, asked for invoking the presence to him of the previous king, Samuel, and asks him for an advice in terms of politics and policies in his government. Another trace that we have is in Homer, and there we'll find Ulysses asking Tiresias his way back home to Ithaca. And Tiresias was very known for his gift of being able to predict and being able to foresee events. Another trace is in 856, when a farmhouse was allegedly infested by ghosts. And then again, we have multiple traces of many historical figures that have populated stories of ghosts. For instance, Anne Boleyn has been seen in her old house in Kent multiple times. As we know, she was the second wife of King Henry VIII, and then she was secluded and confined to the tower until the time of her death. Among the most famous historical figures that have been seen as ghosts, we also have to mention Benjamin Franklin, often seen at the American Philosophical Society, and also that of Peter Stuyvesant, who was the last colonel, the last military man at least, that has been seen in New York since 1672, so a very long time. And he actually was a Dutch colonial officer, just to be more specific, who had a great influence in the early history of New York City. So somebody who was quite famous at the time. And again, here we could mention many other stories. But the truth is that some, I would say also the majority of those stories have one main ingredient in common, one ingredient that they all share. That is, or that seems to be, the fact that those people have not received proper burial, or they might have died in circumstances so death was unexpected, or they died before it was expected. And anyway, this seems not to give peace to them, to their soul, and therefore to create the legend of ghosts. The purpose of today, though, is to focus mostly on ancient history, right? And so to evaluate the culture of ghosts in ancient civilizations. So we're going to start with Mesopotamia, right? They had a pretty terrible and a pretty terrifying, I would say, conception about the afterworld. Death was the final act of life, from which there was no return. Now, the land of the dead was known by many names, and one of the most used names, used again to refer to this territory, this special territory, was Irkalla, the real realm beneath the earth known as the land of no return. And here, the souls of the dead, were left in darkness, fed off dirt, and sipped from mud puddles, right? It's a pretty terrifying world. Now, this is known as the land of non-return. But we actually do know that there was a special dispensation that was given from the Dark Queen Ereshkigal, where actually no soul was permitted to leave Irkalla, but then there was special occasions in which they could be given such a dispensation. And now those cases involved some kind of wrong that had to be compensated, right? So upon one's death, there was created a spiritual entity known as Gedim, and Gedim maintained personal identity, but then traveled to the land of the living and would go there to haunt them. Right? Now, we do know that in other civilizations, we do know that some spirits were pretty much coexisting with the living people, right? Drinking beer with them. But we also know that Gedim would go back to harass the living for no good reason at times, right? So it might be an eerie scenario, the one that we are facing now, with the Gedim going there to harass, also sexually harass. And one of the more surprising elements that I've found is that such harassment is not just carried out by male individuals, by male Gedims, but also by female, who were very common at the time, would go back and would harass sexually their relatives. Now, we also have to imagine that these ghosts, these Gedims coming back to their realm, were so common that in Mesopotamia we will find the another god, the god Shamash, and Shamash would punish Gedims who had slipped out of the Irkalla by having their funerary offerings taken away from them, right? And so sometimes Gedims were seen as extremely positive, going back to their beloved ones just to give some advices or some warnings. But often, and maybe the majority of those times, Gedims were there just to torment the living, right? And so things like exorcisms, amulets, prayers, and charms were very common in Mesopotamia. Let's now then proceed with the ancient Egyptians, right? So, at the time of death, the soul traveled to the Hall of Truth, where it was judged by Osiris and 42 other judges. And basically what would happen, that you would have your soul, your heart actually, weighted in balance with a white feather of truth. If the heart was found lighter than the feather, then the soul would proceed on to the afterlife. But if the heart was heavier, it was thrown to the floor, where it was eaten by a monster, and the soul would cease completely to exist, right? Now, the afterlife, admitted that one was able to go on and proceed in his own journey, the afterlife was known as the Field of Reeds, which was a mirror image of one's life on earth in ancient Egypt. So quite nice, if you had a nice life. And that one would have their old house, their favorite dog, and the stream nearby the house, people who had died previously, and so they had no reason basically to go back and torment anybody. Yet, the concept of a soul suffered from many changes in ancient Egypt. At the beginning, we only had one single entity known as coup. But later on, two components of the soul showed up, right? One was Ba, spirit, and the other one was Ka, personality. Now, they came together after death in the form of Ach. And it was this entity that would return as a ghost. If proper rites had not been observed, or if some sin had been committed, right, then Hak would be given the dispensation to go back, return to Earth, and readdress the wrong. And anyway, so even the ancient Egyptians had their own ways of punishing the living, right? Now, let's go though to the ancient Greeks. In ancient Greece, the afterlife consisted of three distinct realms. Upon death, a coin was placed in one's mouth to pay Charon, the ferryman, to take the soul across the river, which was known as the Styx. Now, this concept of having a river to cross, we'll notice later also that is very much present in other traditions. But anyway, this coin wasn't a payment or anything else. It was just to guarantee a better seat in Charon's boat. Now, once the soul was on the other side, one would pass by a dog known as Cerberus, and then it would stand before three judges, and it would give them a full account on their lives. And when the story had been told, then the judges would compare, and one would be given a cup of water from the river Lethe, and the waters are waters to forget everything about their own past and their former life on Earth. And then, according obviously to the life that one has or had led, then the judges would assign to the soul a specific location. If you had been a warrior, then, and possibly a warrior died in a battle, then you would go to the Elysian fields, which were like a paradise. If you had been a good person, then you would go to the plain of asphodel. Also very much pleasant. But if you had been a bad person, then you deserved Tartarus,
now,
which was
Tartarus,
nothing else,
right,
but
was this
their version
where
of
the soul
hell.
remained
there until he had atoned for the sins of one's life. No soul was condemned to eternal damnation, though. So the soul in Tartarus could become elevated to the plane of asphodel in time. And so there was a way of considering redemption, in this kind of like three realms of afterlife. Also, the Romans had this conception about spirits, right? About them, we do know a story. The story is that Pliny the Younger basically calls up Athenodorus, who goes to Athens and hears of a haunted house, right? And Athenodorus is there, sleeps there, until he sees somebody. First he hears the rattling of chains, and then he wakes, and then he finds actually a man in his room who is a spirit. Now, Athenodorus follows the ghost to a spot in the courtyard of the house, where the spirit suddenly vanishes. So the next day, Athenodorus goes to the city magistrate and asks them to dig up the spot, and then he finds the remains of a man that was chained. At this point, the body is buried with all the proper rites, and the house is no longer haunted, right? And so somehow the Romans had also this very concept of ghosts hunting their houses. Now, this concept of ghosts going back to Earth, going back to the living to torment them, is not at all new in Asian traditions. For instance, the Chinese philosopher Mo Qi argued in favor of incorporating ghosts in their order of things, right? Accepting the presence of ghosts in one's daily life. To the point that in China, we do have the Chinese month of spirits, which is to appease them. Basically, it's the ghost month, and also a specific date that is the 15th of the 7th month, meaning July, basically, where where people actually celebrate ghosts. An interesting element is that in the Chinese culture, or in the Chinese afterlife, something very similar to what happens in the ancient Greek tradition occurs, meaning the soul has to drink something in the Chinese tradition known as Mengpo soup, which caused one to forget one's former life entirely. And at this point, many things can happen, and that depends kind of like on the tradition that is quite split on the topic. So, according to some, basically the soul goes to heaven, whereas according to others, it is reincarnated, right? And now the levels at which the soul is reincarnated pretty much depend on whatever has been learned and whatever has been acquired in one's life. And the tradition of hungry ghosts continue also in India. Here, basically, we have hungry ghosts that are very much recognizable by the fact that they walk backwards, right? And so they actually have, they don't only walk backwards, they also have their feet backwards, which is very interesting because that marks a clear-cut difference between this kind of ghosts and ghosts in ancient Greece, for instance, which were distinguished by ghosts that would appear in dreams and ghosts that would require some sort of like candle, some sort of light to be seen because they were kind of like far off, far away from their relatives. Among the many ghosts, right, to go back to India for a second, the many ghosts and the dangerous boots that we know of, there was one in particular known as the Churail, which was the spirit of a woman who died in childbirth. Now, this ghost was thought to be encountered at crossroads and intersections. Now, if the living person was a woman, the Churail would seek to steal her children or try to possess her body. And if, on the contrary, the living person was a man, it would seek to seduce him and then kill him. And once the boot had lived out his time on earth, even the trail, it would leave and re-enter the stream of reincarnation, which is another happy story that we have from India. And just to continue with this happy thread of thoughts, right, it would seem that not every soul could move on. Here in the picture you see Bangalore Fort in Rajasthan. So this is an important place because it shows that some haunted regions, haunted houses, and even cities, right, were present in the tradition for centuries on end. The city of Bangalore Fort was built under the Mughal Empire in 1573, and there are two actual legends, right? One, once a reclusive hermit was living there, and in one of this version, this hermit was a wise man who gave his blessing to the buildings of the city on one condition, that no one house would rise so high to cast a shadow on his own house, right? And the original builders of the city respected his request, but later the request was forgotten, and so there was a palace being made which casted a shadow over the hermit's home, and therefore he cursed this city, and then there was some sort of earthquake which destroyed completely Bangalore Fort in its entirety. The other version of the story involves the beautiful princess Ratnavi and the evil wizard Baba Balnat. The wizard was in love with the princess, but knew she would never return his feelings. So he concocted a love potion that would powerfully attract the princess to him. But she was completely disgusted by the smell of it, right? Which he presented to her one day in the market. And so Radnavi suspected that the bottle contained not really perfume, but something else. And so she threw the bottle directly to the wizard. The bottle crushed him, and as he was dying, Baba Bolnat cursed Ratnavi and the entire city and swore no one should ever live within its walls again. And so basically right now we think that this was respected by some sort of earthquake that completely destroyed the fort. Let's then move on and turn over to the Maya. For them, we have a conception of a realm of the dead known as xibalba. Here we find again what we have already encountered in other traditions, meaning that the spirit would leave the body and be conducted across a great expanse of water by a spirit dog who would then help the soul navigate through the various trips and traps of the Lord of Xibalba to reach the Tree of Life, which then the soul had to climb up to paradise. Spirits who returned, therefore, were considered unnatural, unless, as with other cultures, they appeared in dreams and were recognizable as friends or family members. A perfect example of spirits going back to life is the story of Xebaban and Utzkolel. Let's start off with Xebaban. So Xebaban was treated poorly by the respected people of the town because she had engaged in an unlawful sex with a man outside of marriage. But she loved the guy and therefore followed the heart. Utzkalel was highly regarded by the upper class because she came from a good family and observed all the rules that the social etiquette imposes. But she was hard-hearted and cruel and cared for no one else but herself. So the story goes as follows. When Xebaban dies, there is this intoxicating fragrance that filled the village, and she was buried. And beautiful wildflowers grew all over her grave and carried the same type of scent. So it was a beautiful, intoxicating fragrance. Shortly afterwards, Utzkolel died though, and this time around, from her body rose a terrible, terrible odor. So the respectable people of the village buried her with a great ceremony and planted many flowers, but then the next day, all the flowers had died, right? And from her grave, the flower known as sakam grew and had no scent, and therefore, like, she became jealous and envy. She then returned to Earth, and she returned as the xtabe, the flower which grows from the sakam cactus. But sometimes assumes a human form and waits for travelers at crossroads. If a man pays attention to her, she seduces and then kills him, while if the traveler is a woman, she punishes by afflicting her peace of mind, especially stealing children. And Aztec that we know of at least had a very similar tradition with ghosts that were very similar to rails, to the ones we have encountered in the Indian tradition. Now, what is striking here is that in Mexico, for instance, the Day of the Dead is a very lively celebration, right? And somehow it is possibly the Christianization process of this day that has turned this day into something negative, or something anyway more somber, if not exactly negative. Possibly this tradition started off in Northern Europe, and specifically in Ireland, with the Samhain. Now, Samhain, that was pronounced Suwen or Samhain, was this pagan tradition of celebrating the life that we live as a cycle, so not as linear, but as a year revolved like a wheel. And Samhain was the end of one cycle and the beginning of the next. This tradition normally took place in late October, early November, and traditionally goes from the 31st of October and goes on until the 2nd of November. Although many modern day sources on the internet and some other popular television shows from the United States claim that Samhain was the Celtic god of the dead, it is a pagan celebration, and possibly from this day we have originated the Christian Day of the Dead, but also the festivity of Halloween. We also know that this interest in ghosts has given birth to another research, that of calculating the soul of the dead, and we do know of Dr. McDowell, who has entered a morgue basically to calculate the weight, and has determined that the weight of the soul is 21 grams. McDowell has also carried out an experiment on dogs and dogs' corpses, I should say, and has seen that dogs do not lose any sort of weight upon their death, and therefore has concluded that men have a soul, whereas dogs don't. McDowell himself has also tried to understand the color of soul. He has seen that the color is neutral, there is no refraction, and therefore soul must be composed, must be made of ether, and that is why no refraction appears. Richard Wiseman has also found that there is a variation in the electromagnetic field when somebody perceives the presence of a soul, right? So he has established also that in a pseudo-scientific way. Now, with that being said, guys, I invite you to leave below your thoughts and your comments. Like the video and comment below, and hit the notification bell so you can receive any new update, any new notification of videos that are being uploaded on the channel. And I'll await your comments. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you believe in ghosts or not, and why. I'll talk to you soon. Let's meet again in the next new episodes uploaded on this channel. Thank you for tolerating me, and goodbye. Bye.